Part 1. The Arrival. The gravel road twisted like a serpent through the dense forest, narrowing with every passing mile. Logan's beat-up SUV rattled with each pothole, the engine protesting the climb into the deep woods. Overhanging branches clawed at the windshield, their skeletal fingers leaving faint scratches in the dust. The sunlight had long since surrendered to a thick canopy of leaves, leaving the road bathed in a murky twilight. In the back seat, laughter tried to mask the unease. "This is the middle of nowhere, man," Cassie muttered, blowing a bubble with her gum before popping it sharply. Her phone was in her hand, recording the forest as it swallowed them whole. "Like there's no Wi-Fi here, no signal. If we die, no one's gonna find us." "Exactly," Logan said, grinning as he adjusted his grip on the steering wheel. "Perfect for the documentary. Urban legends, haunted woods, abandoned cabin. It's got everything. Instant viral hit." Jared, slouched in the passenger seat, leaned forward just enough to glance at Logan. His expression was skeptical, but his fingers drummed nervously on his thigh. "You really think people are gonna believe that tree spirits whisper your name, or that anyone cares about your Blair Witch knockoff?" Logan shot him a quick look, the smirk on his face faltering just slightly. "That's why we're here, to prove it's not just a story. The legend of Black Hollow is real." Cassie snorted. "Yeah, because all the people who came out here before and disappeared just forgot to leave Yelp reviews." The tension in the SUV rose as the forest thickened around them. It wasn't just the darkness, it was the way the trees seemed to lean in, their gnarled trunks twisting as if craning to hear their conversation. A sign appeared, half hidden behind overgrown vines. The rusted metal dangled precariously from a single bolt. "Welcome to Black Hollow," Jared read aloud, his voice dropping into mock drama. "Population blank? What? They couldn't even keep track of how many people got eaten by the woods?" Logan didn't answer. His focus was locked on the road ahead, which seemed to narrow even more, as though the forest itself was trying to swallow them whole. Another mile passed in silence, broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional groan of the SUV's suspension. And then through the haze of shadow and mist, it appeared. The cabin. It was smaller than they had imagined, tucked into a hollow of towering pines that loomed like silent sentinels. The structure leaned awkwardly to one side, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and neglect. Boards were nailed haphazardly across the windows, their edges curling with age. An ancient rocking chair sat on the porch, creaking softly, though no wind stirred the air. "Well," Logan said, cutting the engine, "here we are, home sweet home." Cassie opened her door cautiously, her sneakers crunching against the gravel. "This looks like the kind of place where people go missing in horror movies," she muttered, raising her phone to film. "We're so dead." Jared climbed out next, stretching his legs and squinting at the cabin. "Great. We're staying in a shack that looks like it wants to eat us." Logan ignored them, popping the trunk and hauling out their gear. "Come on, quit whining. We've got work to do. Sunset's in an hour, and I want some B-roll before it gets dark." They unpacked hastily, tossing sleeping bags and equipment through the splintered doorway. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. Dust motes danced in the faint light streaming through cracks in the walls. The floor groaned under every step, as though protesting their presence. Cassie wrinkled her nose. "Ugh, this place smells like death." "Adds to the authenticity," Logan quipped, setting up a tripod in the center of the room. By the time they finished setting up, night had fallen. The forest outside the windows was an impenetrable wall of black, its silence unnerving. No stars pierced the canopy, no moonlight filtered through the trees, just the endless stretch of whispering leaves. Jared glanced at the boarded windows and shivered. "You hear that?" Logan didn't look up. "Hear what?" "The leaves," Jared said, his voice quieter now. "They're moving." Cassie rolled her eyes. "They're trees, genius. That's what they do." "No," Jared insisted, stepping closer to the window. "It's not the wind. Listen." They fell silent, the only sound their own breathing. And then faintly it came, the unmistakable sound of whispering, soft, incoherent, voices carried on a breeze too gentle to feel. Logan exchanged a glance with Cassie. Probably just the wind through the branches. But Jared shook his head, his face pale. No, it's different. Before anyone could respond, the rocking chair on the porch creaked loudly. All three of them froze. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken, pressing against their skin like an unseen hand. Cassie grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she started recording again. Did anyone else see that? The rocking chair creaked again, slower this time, as if it were answering her. Logan swallowed hard, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. See? It's perfect. The cabin's already performing for us. But the unease in his voice betrayed him. Outside, the whispers grew louder, no longer content to stay in the trees. The Black Hollow Diner sat on the edge of town like an afterthought. Its cracked neon sign buzzed faintly, struggling to spell out the word diner against the encroaching darkness. Inside, the smell of grease and old coffee clung to the peeling vinyl booths. A single ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, its blades coated in years of dust. Logan, Cassie, and Jared sat in the farthest booth, their gear piled on the table between them. The waitress shuffled over, a frail woman with milky white eyes that seemed to look past them, not at them. She took their orders with a shaking hand, scribbling slowly on a notepad as though each stroke required effort. When Logan mentioned the cabin, her hand froze. You're heading up to Black Hollow? Her voice was a dry rasp, barely louder than the hum of the fan. Logan grinned. That's right. Got a project we're working on. We'll be fine. The waitress leaned in, her breath faintly sour. Don't talk to the trees, she whispered, her voice trembling. Cassie raised an eyebrow. What? The old woman's milky eyes darted between them. No matter what you hear, no matter who you hear, you don't answer them. You don't talk back. Logan chuckled nervously. Thanks for the tip. But the waitress didn't smile. Her hands trembled as she stepped back, muttering something under her breath that none of them could quite catch. As they left, Jared glanced back. She was still standing, there, staring after them, her face a mask of unease. They laughed about it the entire drive. Don't talk to the trees, Cassie mimicked, blowing a bubble with her gum. What, are the trees gonna call us by name and tell us to pay our taxes? Logan grinned, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Maybe they'll ask us to plant. More of them. Jared, slouched in the passenger seat, smirked. Yeah, or maybe they just get lonely. But as the forest swallowed the road and the light faded, the memory of the waitress's trembling voice began to stick. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fully descended. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and old wood. They set up cameras in the corners, their tiny red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Logan made a fire in the stone hearth, the flickering flames casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. Cassie sprawled out on one of the sleeping bags, beer in hand. So, what's the plan, Mr. Director? We just sit around and wait for the trees to start talking? Logan smirked. Patience, my dear Cassie. These things take time. In the meantime, he grabbed a deck of cards from his bag and held it up. How about a game? First one to chicken out buys dinner when we get back. Cassie raised her beer. You're on. Jared rolled his eyes but reached for a beer himself. Fine, but I'm not paying for anything fancy. The laughter came easily at first, filling the small cabin with warmth. For a while, the woods outside felt distant, almost forgettable. But then came the noise. A groan. Long and low, like the forest itself shifting under its own weight. The laughter stopped. What was that? Cassie asked, sitting up. Probably just the wind, Logan said quickly, though his eyes darted toward the door. Jared stood grinning. Let's find out. Don't, Cassie said, her voice sharp. But Jared was already at the door. He threw it open, the night spilling in like a cold breath. The fire flickered violently, shadows dancing madly across the walls. Jared stepped onto the porch, cupping his hands around his mouth. Hey, he shouted into the trees. Tell us your secrets, you creepy bastards. A gust of wind answered, rushing through the clearing. fire sputtered again. And then, the whisper. Jared. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice. Jared froze, his grin fading. "Did you hear that?" he called back over his shoulder. Logan stood slowly, his face pale. "Get inside." But Jared didn't move. He stared into the blackness beyond the trees, his breath fogging the cold air. "Jared." The voice came again, fainter, this time like it was retreating deeper into the woods. It was unmistakable. It was his own name. Cassie stood now, clutching her beer like a lifeline. "Close the door, Jared," she whispered. Then came another whisper. "Cassie." Her head snapped toward the sound. It was the same voice, faint, playful, familiar. They all heard it now. A new name. Logan. The whispers came faster, overlapping, curling, through the trees like smoke. "Cassie." "Jared." "Logan." Cassie backed away from the door. "Logan," she said, her voice trembling. "Close the door." The fire flickered again, shrinking into a fragile glow. Logan moved quickly, grabbing Jared by the arm and yanking him inside. He slammed the door shut, bolting it with trembling hands. The cabin fell silent. For a moment, the only sound was their breathing, ragged and uneven. "Tell me you heard that," Cassie whispered. Jared nodded, his face pale. "It said my name." "It said all our names," Logan muttered. Outside, the whispers continued, just beyond the tree line. The group huddled together, staring at the door as the wind picked up again. Only this time it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like laughter. Part 2, the first night. The cabin door slammed shut with a deafening bang, rattling the old hinges and sending a shiver through the group. "Jesus!" Cassie exclaimed, clutching her beer so tightly that it almost slipped from her grasp. Jared let out a nervous laugh, walking to the door and locking it with a shaky hand. He slid the deadbolt across, the sound of metal grinding against wood unusually loud in the tense silence. "Okay, that was weird," he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Wind," Cassie muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. She wrapped her jacket tighter around herself, glancing uneasily at the windows. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows crawling along the warped wooden walls. The flickering light gave the cabin an almost alive quality, the dark corners seeming to stretch and shift just beyond the edge of their vision. Outside, the whispers had stopped, or maybe they had just grown too faint to hear. Logan clapped his hands together, his attempt at levity sounding hollow in the heavy atmosphere. "All right, enough spooking ourselves out. Let's focus. Who's up for some ghost stories? Or better yet, board games? We brought Monopoly, right?" Cassie groaned. "Please, no Monopoly. I'd rather take my chances with the haunted trees." Jared smirked, grabbing a deck of cards from his bag. "Fine, poker it is. Loser cleans up in the morning." The group forced themselves to relax, their nervous laughter filling the cabin as they played cards and told stories. Cassie played music, from a portable speaker, the soft hum of the tunes blending with the crackling fire. It almost felt normal. Almost. But every so often, one of them would glance toward the windows or the door. Just a quick look, just to check. By midnight, exhaustion won. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint reddish light across the room. Sleeping bags were unrolled, the group spreading out across the cabin floor. Logan snored softly in his corner, his arm draped over his face. Jared lay curled up, muttering incoherently in his sleep. Cassie lay on her back, staring at the ceiling. Creaks of the cabin filled the silence, a slow rhythmic sound like the building was breathing with them. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, its voice carrying into the dark. Cassie closed her eyes, trying to convince herself that it was just an old cabin settling. Nothing more. It was the sound that woke her, a faint, scratching noise. Right by her head, her eyes snapped open, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She lay perfectly still, straining her ears. The sound came again, closer this time. Something was scraping against the wall, Her heart hammered in her chest as she turned her head slowly, her eyes adjusting to the pitch black of the room. Shadows stretched and twisted in the faint glow of the dying fire. And then she heard it. A whisper, low and rhythmic, curling through the dark like smoke. It wasn't outside. It was inside the walls. Her breath caught as the voice dragged her name out in a slow, wet murmur. Cassie! The sound was wrong. It was faint but deliberate, each syllable stretching unnaturally, like a dying breath. She bolted upright, her pulse pounding in her ears. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the others. Logan stirred, across from her, mumbling in his sleep. Jared twitched in his sleeping bag, his face slack with unconsciousness. But Olivia... Cassie's stomach dropped. Olivia's sleeping bag was empty. Her spot on the floor was abandoned, the blanket tossed, aside as if she'd left in a hurry. And then she noticed the door. It hung open, swaying lightly on its hinges. A cold draft crept into the room, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and pine. Cassie shot to her feet, her voice trembling. Liv? Olivia? The others woke with a start. Logan groaned, rubbing his eyes. What? What's going on? Olivia's gone, Cassie said, her voice sharp with panic. She pointed to the door. She went outside. Jared sat up, blinking blearily. What? Why the hell would she go out there? The cabin seemed to groan around them, the wooden walls creaking ominously. The whispering had stopped, but the silence it left behind was somehow worse. Logan was on, his feet now grabbing the flashlight from his bag. Okay, relax. Maybe she just needed some air. Air? At 2 a.m? Cassie snapped. Did you not hear what I heard? She's not just outside. Something's out there. Logan hesitated, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Cassie, it's an old cabin. It makes noises. She probably just... A sound cut him off. A faint laugh. It came from just beyond the open door, soft and melodic. It wasn't Olivia's laugh. Jared's face went pale. What the hell was that? Logan took a step toward the door, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly. Olivia, is that you? No answer. The laughter came again, fainter this time, as if retreating deeper into the woods. Cassie grabbed Logan's arm. Don't you dare go out there. But Logan shook her off, his jaw tightening. We can't just leave her. He stepped out, onto the porch, shining the flashlight into the thick wall of trees. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating only a few gnarled trunks and the swirling mist beyond. Olivia? He called again, his voice shaking now. Silence, then, just barely audible. Logan. The voice was soft, familiar, but it wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the cabin, behind them. Cassie's blood ran cold. Logan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Get back inside, now. Logan turned, his flashlight swinging back toward the open doorway. The light trembled as it caught something, just for a moment. A shadow, standing in the corner of the room, watching. They ran into the night without thinking. Flashlights swung wildly, casting erratic beams through the dense forest. Each breath came sharp and shallow in the biting cold, their calls for Olivia tearing through the otherwise suffocating silence. Olivia! Logan shouted, his voice cracking. Liv! Cassie's cry trembled, her flashlight shaking in her grip. But the trees gave no answer. The woods felt endless, their towering trunks stretching into the starless sky. Branches tangled above like skeletal arms, casting twisted shadows that seemed to move when no one was looking. The ground beneath their feet was soft and uneven, the forest floor swallowing their footsteps. Jared stopped suddenly, panting. She's not here, he muttered, his voice edged with panic. We've been calling her for 10 minutes, she would have answered. Cassie whirled on him, her eyes blazing. So what? We just leave her out here? Alone? Before Jared could respond, Logan's beam caught something up ahead. Wait, he said, his voice hushed. What's that? They hurried toward it, their boots crunching against the frost-laced leaves. Logan stopped at the base of a massive pine tree, his flashlight fixed on a scrap of fabric tangled high in the branches. sweatshirt. The pink hoodie was shredded, its fabric fluttering faintly in the cold night air. It clung to a branch at least 15 feet off the ground, impossibly high for any of them to reach. Cassie gasped, her breath fogging in the freezing air. How did it get up there? Jared stepped closer, his flashlight trembling. No animal did that, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They stared in silence for a moment, the beam of Logan's flashlight climbing the tree trunk. That's when they saw the marks. Deep claw marks raked into the bark, jagged and uneven. Each groove was nearly an inch deep, carved into the wood with terrifying force. Cassie's hand flew to her mouth. What could have done that? Jared shook, his head slowly, his face pale. Nothing I want to meet. The forest seemed to press in around them, the shadows deepening. The air was colder now, biting against their exposed skin. Let's get back to the cabin, Logan said abruptly, his voice hard. Now. They stumbled back to the cabin, their pace quick and unsteady. Logan slammed the door behind them, twisting the lock with a sharp click. The room was eerily quiet, the faint smell of smoke from the extinguished fire lingering in the cold air. Cassie sank onto her bunk, her head in her hands. Jared leaned against the wall, his face tight with frustration. Maybe she wandered, often got lost, he offered weakly, though his voice lacked conviction. Cassie lifted her head, her eyes red-rimmed. In the middle of the night, with no flashlight, no jacket, she shook her head. She wouldn't do that. No one responded. The room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the soft creak of the cabin settling around them. Then, bang! The door slammed shut again. All three of them jumped, their flashlights whipping toward the noise. Jared stared at the door, his hand still gripping the wall for support. "Tell me someone touched that," he said, his voice trembling. Logan shook his head slowly. No one was near it. Cassie stood, her pulse pounding in her ears. "It's the wind," she said, though she didn't sound convinced. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive. Then, a whisper. It wasn't faint this time. It was clear, soft, and deliberate. "I'm cold. Let me in." Cassie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Logan nodded, his flashlight already sweeping across the room. The whisper came again, curling, through the air like smoke. "Let me in." The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside. The beam of Logan's flashlight landed on the tiny crawlspace door beneath the stairs. The old wooden panel looked out of place, its edges warped with age. Something was tapping on the other side, tap, tap, tap. Jared took a step back, his face pale. "No way," he muttered. "No way." Logan crept toward the crawlspace, his flashlight steady despite the tension in his shoulders. He crouched in front of the door, his hand hovering over the latch. "Don't," Cassie hissed, her voice sharp with fear. "Don't open it." But Logan didn't move. The tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. Then the whisper came again, louder this time. "Let me in. It's cold." Cassie's breath hitched as she backed away. "Logan," she said, her voice trembling. "Step away from the door." But Logan stayed frozen, his hand trembling as he reached for the latch. From behind the door came a low, wet sound. Something breathing. Something waiting. Part 3. The realization. No one moved. The air in the cabin felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. Cassie's flashlight quivered in her trembling hand, the beam darting erratically across the dusty floorboards. The tapping had stopped, for only a moment before it resumed, louder, more insistent. "Let me in." The voice was soft and pleading, barely louder than a whisper. But something was wrong. It wasn't Olivia's voice anymore. It was close, almost right, but not quite. There was a distortion, a hollow echo, as if someone was trying to mimic her, without fully understanding how a human voice worked. "Logan?" The whisper came again, this time with a sharp edge, the desperation bleeding into the air. Logan took a shaky step toward the crawlspace door, the tapping from behind it echoing in the small room. His hand stretched out as if compelled by something beyond reason. "What if she's trapped?" he said, his voice cracking. Jared grabbed Logan's arm, yanking him back. "No," he said firmly, his face pale but resolute. "That's not her." The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the air itself, pressing down on them like a weight. Then, bang! The sound exploded from the back of the cabin, sharp and violent. All three of them spun around, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. "Did you see that?" Cassie whispered, her breath misting in the freezing air. Logan shook his head, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. "What was it?" "Nothing," Jared muttered, though his voice wavered. "There's nothing there." But Cassie wasn't so sure. The room had dropped to freezing in seconds, her breath swirling in front of her like faint smoke. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The wind outside picked up again, howling around the cabin, rattling the boarded-up windows. But this time, it wasn't just wind. It carried voices, not faint whispers like before, clear, distinct words. "Logan, come outside." Cassie's stomach twisted. Her eyes darted toward Logan, who was staring at the window, his face pale and unmoving. "Cassie, help me." Cassie's breath hitched. The voice was soft and familiar. It sounded like Olivia, but not quite. "Jared, I miss you." Jared flinched, visibly, his flashlight dropping for a moment before he fumbled to steady it again. Each of them had heard something different. Cassie's voice broke the silence first. "What is this?" Logan didn't respond. He was still staring at the window, his flashlight aimed at the frost-covered glass. Outside, the wind continued to howl, the voices growing louder, layering over one another until they formed an incomprehensible cacophony. And then they stopped. The abrupt silence was worse than the noise. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the shadows stretching unnaturally long as the embers in the fireplace flickered weakly. Jared turned back toward the crawlspace door, his flashlight beam catching the warped edges of the wood. The door was cracked open. "That wasn't open before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Logan stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He crouched down, shining his flashlight into the dark void behind the door. "Don't," Cassie hissed, gripping his arm, but Logan didn't stop. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing nothing but splintered wood and dirt. "Empty," he muttered, exhaling shakily. Cassie didn't relax. She could feel it. The cabin wasn't empty. Suddenly, the tapping returned, not from the crawl space this time, from the walls, soft at first, then faster, harder. The sound multiplied, coming from all sides, surrounding them. Cassie spun in place, her flashlight beam bouncing across the room. "Where is it coming from?" she shouted. Jared's voice was tight with fear. "Everywhere!" The tapping turned to banging. The walls shuddered under the force, the vibrations rattling the furniture. "Let me in." The voice returned, louder and sharper. "Let me in." The windows began to rattle violently, the frosted glass trembling in its frames. The wind howled again, and this time, the voices outside screamed with it. Logan, Cassie, Jared. Their names echoed, overlapping, growing in intensity. And then, crash. One of the boards over a window splintered, the glass behind it shattering inward. Cassie screamed, stumbling back as icy wind blasted through the cabin. "Out!" Logan shouted, grabbing her arm. "We need to get out." Jared hesitated, his eyes darting toward the crawlspace door. It hung open, the darkness inside seeming to stretch endlessly. "Jared, move!" Logan shouted again. Snapping out of his trance, Jared bolted toward the front door, but as they reached it, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire cabin. The deadbolt slid into place on its own. They were trapped. Cassie pounded on the door, her voice breaking. "Let us out!" The whispers returned, softer now, curling around them like smoke. "Why are you leaving? Stay with us. We're so lonely." The three of them huddled together in the center of the room, their flashlights trembling in their hands. The banging on the walls stopped. The cabin fell silent once more, but this time, the silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the cabin like a living thing. Cassie clamped her hands over her ears, pressing so hard her knuckles turned white. It didn't help. The voices weren't just outside anymore, they were inside her head. Cassie, come see. Logan, don't leave. Jared, we need you. The words slithered into her thoughts, twisting like vines as if they were trying to root themselves in her mind. Across the room, Jared stumbled toward the frost-covered window, his flashlight shaking in his hand. His breath fogged the glass as he squinted into the darkness. Something moved, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast to follow. Then another, and then he saw her. "She's out there," Jared shouted, his voice cracking with both fear and hope. Cassie dropped her hands and turned sharply. "What? Olivia!" Jared cried. "She's at the tree line!" He pointed, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness and landing on a figure standing just beyond the edge of the forest. It was Olivia, or at least, it looked like her. She was beckoning to him, one hand raised in a slow, deliberate motion. The other hung at her side, limp and bloody, crimson streaks glinting faintly in the flashlight's glow. "She's hurt," Jared shouted, lunging toward the door. "No!" Cassie grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all her strength. "It's a trick. It's not her." Jared turned on her, his face twisted with desperation. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do," she snapped. "Look at her hand." Jared hesitated, his gaze snapping back to the window. The figure, Olivia, or whatever it was gone. The flashlight beam illuminated nothing but shadow and mist. Logan was crouched near the fireplace, clutching his head. His breathing was shallow and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Make it stop," he murmured. "Make it stop. Make it stop." Cassie knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder. "Logan, we need to barricade the cabin, now." The three of them worked quickly, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. Jared and Logan pushed the small, splintered table against the front door, then dragged the heavy dresser from the bedroom to block the largest window. Every creak of the wood made them jump, their heads snapping toward every sound. Cassie, her heart pounding, found herself drawn to the old bookshelf in the corner. The shelves were warped, the books coated in a thick layer of dust. She ran her fingers along the spines, pausing on titles so faded they were illegible. Then, one of the books fell to the floor with a heavy thud. The sound cut through the cabin like a gunshot. Logan and Jared froze, their eyes darting toward Cassie. She bent down slowly, her hands trembling, and picked up the fallen book. It was bound in cracked, weathered leather, its edges worn from years of handling. She opened it carefully, her fingers brushing over the brittle, yellowed pages. The handwriting inside was faded but legible, messy scrawls filling every inch of the paper, notes, warnings. One passage caught her eye, written in dark, frantic ink. "They speak in the voices you trust. They become the ones you love. If you answer them, if you follow, you're lost forever." Cassie's blood ran cold. Her hands shook as she turned the page. The forest is not alive. The forest is possessed. Her breath hitched as the words sank in. She stared at the book, unable to tear her eyes away, even as the air in the cabin grew colder. Suddenly, the door creaked, slow, deliberate. Cassie snapped her head up. The barricade hadn't moved. The furniture still pressed firmly against the door. But the door itself was opening, as if by its own will. An icy gust swept through the cabin, extinguishing the last embers in the fireplace. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, a rich, rotten scent that made Cassie gag. And then she saw her, standing in the doorway. Olivia. But it wasn't Olivia. Her eyes were entirely black, glossy, and empty, like twin pools of ink. Her head tilted to one side, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were a puppet held up by invisible strings. A slow, crooked smile stretched across her face, too wide and too sharp to be human. "Come outside," she journal slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Logan and Jared froze, their faces pale as they stared at what used to be their friend. Jared's voice trembled. "Oh, Olivia?" The thing in the doorway didn't answer. It stepped forward, the sound of its bare feet against the wooden floor unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. Cassie backed into the wall, her breath coming in short gasps. "That's not Olivia," she whispered. The thing smiled wider, its black eyes fixed on her. "We've been waiting for you," it said, its voice layered, as though more than one person was speaking. "Come see what we found." Part 4. The rules of the forest. Cassie slammed the heavy journal shut, her trembling hands leaving faint prints in the dust on the cracked leather cover. The sound echoed in the oppressive silence of the cabin. "This cabin isn't safe anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heartbeat. The shadows in the room seemed alive now, no longer bound to the flickering light of the lantern. They slithered along the walls and floor like living vines, inching closer with every second. Olivia, or the thing wearing her face, took another slow, deliberate step inside. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as if her body was being dragged forward by an invisible force. Her head tilted sharply to one side, and that too wide smile stretched even further, splitting her pale face in half. "You have to come see," Olivia crooned, her voice crackling like a broken speaker, layered with something darker, something ancient. Jared grabbed a broken chair leg, gripping it tightly like a weapon. His knuckles turned white as he took a step back, placing himself between the thing and Cassie. Logan stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering wildly as his shaking hands struggled to keep it steady. Cassie flipped the journal open again, frantically scanning the brittle pages for answers. The writing was erratic, filled with warnings scrawled in uneven, desperate ink. Another passage jumped out at her. "Never answer when the trees call. Never leave the light. Never, ever speak to them first." Her breath caught as she looked up at the others, her voice trembling. "We broke the rules," Cassie said, her words heavy with dread. "We spoke first." Logan's face drained of color. "You mean, when Jared joked into the woods?" Cassie nodded, her expression grim. "We invited them in." The realization hit like a thunderclap, the weight of their mistake crashing down on them all at once. Logan stumbled to the nearest window, his flashlight sweeping across the forest outside. His breath fogged the glass as he whispered, "So this, all of this, it's because of me?" Before anyone could answer, a loud thump shook the cabin. The sound reverberated through the small space, rattling the loose boards and sending a fresh wave of terror through them. "Did that come from the back?" Jared whispered, his voice breaking. The lantern sputtered, its flame shrinking and flickering, casting the room into an eerie half-darkness. The shadows on the walls writhed and stretched, reaching closer, like they were alive and hungry. Cassie's eyes fell back to the journal, her fingers turning the pages with increasing desperation. Her eyes scanned the chaotic handwriting until another note in the margins caught her attention. "If you see yourself outside, don't follow. If you see your loved ones, don't listen. They are the trees now." The words sent a chill down her spine, icy and paralyzing. She looked up, her voice shaking as she whispered, "It's not them." Jared's grip on the broken chair leg faltered. "What do you mean?" "Everything we've seen. Olivia, the voices, the faces, it's all them," Cassie said, gesturing to the window in the forest beyond. "It's the forest. It's been them the whole time. They're tricking us." Logan stared at her, his face pale and damp with sweat. "The forest?" Cassie pointed to the journal, her finger trembling as it landed on the words scrawled in dark, frantic ink. "They are the trees now." "They're not alive," Cassie said, her voice cracking. "They're possessed." Another thump shook the cabin, this time louder, as though something massive had thrown itself against the back wall. The lantern finally gave out, plunging them into near total darkness. The faint glow of the moon seeped through the cracks in the walls, barely enough to illuminate the terrified expressions on their faces. "Barricade the door," Logan shouted, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. Jared and Cassie scrambled to push furniture against the door and windows. The table, a chair, even the dresser, all shoved hastily into place. But deep down, they knew it wouldn't be enough. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse now, swelling and shrinking as if breathing. Cassie's hands trembled as she clutched the journal to her chest. She couldn't stop hearing the words over and over in her head. If you see yourself outside, don't follow. If you see your loved ones, don't listen. And then, the door creaked. Slow, deliberate. The barricade held firm, but the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the old wood settling. Something was trying to come in. Logan. The voice was sweet, familiar, and painfully warm. It sounded exactly like his mother. "It's okay, sweetheart. Come outside. I'm waiting for you." Logan froze, his flashlight clattering to the floor. Jared reached for his arm, his voice urgent. "Logan, don't listen. It's not real." But Logan's eyes were glazed, his body stiff. "It's her," he whispered. "She's here." "Jared." The next voice cut through the room, soft and full of sorrow. It was Olivia again, but this time she sounded broken. "Jared, I'm so scared. Please, help me." Jared turned toward the window, his grip on the chair leg faltering. "She's hurt," he whispered. "Don't," Cassie hissed, grabbing his arm. "That's not her. You know it's not her." The shadows writhed closer, wrapping around their legs like creeping vines. The temperature in the room plummeted, frost forming along the edges of the glass. The voices outside grew louder, overlapping, forming a cacophony of familiar tones. "Come outside. We found something for you. It's safe now." Cassie's breath hitched as she backed away, clutching the journal like a shield. The realization settled like a heavy weight in her chest. They weren't fighting Olivia. They weren't fighting voices. They were fighting the forest, and the forest was winning. Cassie stood her ground, gripping the leather journal tightly in her trembling hands. Her chest rose and fell with shallow, rapid breaths, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You're not her," she said, forcing steel into her tone. The creature's smile widened unnaturally, its cracked lips stretching far beyond what should have been possible. Thick black saliva dripped from the corners of its mouth, pooling on the floorboards. "Aren't you lonely, Cassie?" it crooned, its voice layered with a sickly sweetness that turned her stomach. "Don't you miss us?" Behind her, Jared and Logan backed toward the fireplace, their eyes darting around the room for anything they could use as a weapon. Jared clutched the broken chair leg like a baseball bat, while Logan grabbed the rusted poker from the hearth. But even as they armed themselves, it was already too late. The shadows that had lingered at the edges of the room began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, like a living mist pouring in from the corners. They slipped along the floor, curling like smoke, tendrils reaching hungrily for their ankles. The cabin itself groaned under an unseen weight. The wood creaked and popped as if something massive were pressing down on it. Cassie flinched, but she didn't move. She refused to give the thing any ground. "Stay back," she said through gritted teeth. But the creature only tilted its head, its empty black eyes gleaming with mockery. "You invited us, Cassie," it whispered. "We're just here to help." Suddenly, a new voice spoke. It wasn't Olivia's voice. It wasn't Jared's, or Logan's, or even Dylan's. It was Cassie's own voice. "Cassie, it's me," the voice called softly, drifting in from the direction of the trees. "Help me. Please help me." Cassie's breath hitched. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears as if that could block out the sound. Behind her, Jared and Logan did the same, their faces pale and taut with fear. The shadows crawled closer. The creature's laughter bubbled up, wet and guttural, filling the cabin like a plague. But Logan faltered. His hands dropped from his ears. His eyes fluttered open. "Cassie," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I heard her." "No, Logan," Cassie said sharply, not daring to open her eyes. "It's not real. Don't listen to it." But Logan wasn't looking at Cassie. His gaze was fixed on the door, his expression slack and distant. From outside, the voice came again, louder this time. "Logan, sweetheart, it's me. It's Mom. I need you." A single tear slid down Logan's cheek. His grip on the fireplace poker loosened until it fell to the floor with a dull clang. "Mom," he whispered, taking a small, hesitant step toward the door. "Logan, stop!" Cassie shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "It's not her!" Jared lunged for Logan, desperation in his eyes. "Don't do this, man!" But it was too late. Logan stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, as if drawn by an invisible thread. The cabin door creaked open as if welcoming him, revealing the inky blackness of the forest beyond. "Logan, no!" Jared screamed, grabbing for him. But Logan was already outside. The darkness swallowed him whole, his silhouette disappearing into the whispering trees. The door slammed shut behind him with a thunderous bang that echoed through the cabin. For a moment, the three of them, Cassie, Jared, and the thing wearing Olivia's face, stood frozen. The cabin groaned again, its wooden walls flexing as if breathing. And then, the whispers returned. This time they weren't soft or pleading. They were louder, more forceful, more numerous. Cassie, Jared, Logan. Their names overlapped, rising and falling like waves, the voices pushing against their minds with unbearable pressure. Cassie clutched her head, her knees buckling as the journal slipped from her hands. "Logan!" she screamed, her voice cracking with despair. But the forest didn't answer, it only whispered. Part 5. Fight or Flight. The cabin trembled violently, its wooden frame groaning as though under siege by an invisible storm. Dust rained down from the beams overhead, filling the air with the choking scent of age and decay. Cassie and Jared pressed, their backs to the fireplace, clutching their makeshift weapons like lifelines. Jared's knuckles were white around the broken chair leg, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The scratching started softly, faint and distant, like the scuttle of claws on wood. But it grew. The sound swelled, tearing through the cabin walls with sharp, jagged force like nails raking across brittle bone. And the whispering, it wasn't outside anymore. It was inside their heads. "Cassie, Jared, come outside. It's safe now. We miss you. We forgive you." Cassie clamped her, hands over her ears, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. "Stop," she screamed. But the voices only laughed in response, a hollow, echoing sound that made her skin crawl. Behind them, the fireplace flared to life with a sudden whoosh, the flames roaring unnaturally high. Heat surged through the room, searing and oppressive, as if the fire had been stoked from beneath the earth itself. Cassie's eyes darted to Jared, who was staring at the flames, frozen in place. "We have to run," she hissed, grabbing his arm. Jared shook his head, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Run where? They're everywhere." The cabin groaned again, the walls warping as shadows began to stretch and twist, creeping toward them like living things. "We can't stay here," Cassie snapped. Her voice was firm, but her hands shook as she pulled Jared toward the kitchen. They smashed open the old window with the leg of the chair, shards of glass scattering onto the counter and floor. The cold air outside rushed in, biting and sharp, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the cabin. "Go!" Cassie shouted, shoving Jared forward. One by one, they vaulted through the shattered window, tumbling into the freezing dirt outside. The impact knocked the wind from Cassie's lungs, but she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the sting of the cold against her palms. The forest greeted them with a deafening silence. No wind, no crickets, no rustling leaves. It was the kind of silence that screamed louder than any noise, pressing against their eardrums and making their hearts pound in their chests. "Run!" Cassie whispered, barely able to hear her own voice. They sprinted into the woods, their footsteps crunching against frost-covered leaves. The path twisted ahead of them, winding through the dense forest. But something was wrong. The trees seemed to move. Cassie glanced around, her breath catching as she realized the trunks were rearranging themselves, shifting and leaning to block their way. "This isn't right," Jared panted, his voice panicked. "We're running in circles." Cassie's heart sank as she looked back over her shoulder. The cabin was gone from view, swallowed by the darkness. But so was the path they'd taken to get here. Behind them, shadows moved between the trees. At first, they were shapeless and fleeting, barely visible against the dark trunks. But as Cassie's eyes adjusted, she saw them more clearly. Faces, familiar faces. Olivia, Dylan, even Logan. But they weren't right. Their heads lolled to one side, their necks bent at unnatural angles. Their joints moved in jerking, stilted motions, as though their bodies were being pulled by invisible strings. And their mouths hung open, whispering. Not just any whispers. Secrets. Secrets Cassie thought no one else could ever know. "You remember the thing you did?" Olivia's voice cooed, soft and poisonous. "The thing you never told Jared." Cassie stumbled, her stomach twisting into knots. Jared grabbed her arm, his face etched with terror. "What is it?" "Nothing," Cassie said quickly, her voice trembling. She squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look at the shadows, at the faces. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, pressing in from all sides. "Cassie, Jared, we forgive you." She gritted her teeth, pushing herself harder, faster, dragging Jared along with her. "Don't listen to them," she panted. "They're lying." But the faces grew closer. Their movements were jerky but deliberate, like puppets controlled by an unseen hand. Olivia's face twisted into a grotesque grin, her mouth moving soundlessly for a moment before her voice echoed again. "Come back, Cassie. We miss you." Jared's grip tightened on Cassie's arm. "Cassie, what are they talking about?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. "Just keep running," she shouted. The forest seemed endless now, the path ahead dissolving into a maze of shifting trees and shadowy figures. The voices overlapped, a cacophony of accusations and pleas, pulling at her resolve with every step. But Cassie kept her eyes forward, her breaths ragged, her legs burning, because she knew if she stopped, if she even hesitated, they wouldn't make it out alive. Jared's foot caught on something hidden beneath the thick carpet of rotting leaves. He went down hard, the breath knocked out of him as he sprawled across the dirt. "Jared!" Cassie skidded to a stop, turning back to him. She dropped to her knees, grabbing his arm to pull him up, but her hand froze mid-reach. In the faint moonlight filtering through the twisting branches above, she saw it. At the base of a massive oak tree, its roots gnarled and blackened by decay, lay an ancient shrine. Bones were scattered across the ground, ribs, femurs, fragments of skulls, all brittle with age and coated in moss. The tree's low branches were adorned with old yellowed photographs, each pinned with rusty nails that oozed orange streaks down the bark. The faces in the photos were blurred, distorted as if by time, or something darker. And on the altar, nestled between the gnarled roots, sat a withered leather book. Its cover was dark and cracked, wrapped in a net of thorns that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. Cassie felt her breath hitch. Her eyes locked on the book, an awful magnetic pull drawing her toward it. Her heart pounded as the whispers returned, louder now, curling around her like a suffocating fog. "Cassie, you know what to do." The air around her grew heavier, colder. She felt herself leaning forward, her hand reaching toward the book of its own accord. "Don't!" Jared's voice broke through the haze, pulling her back. She blinked, shaking her head violently. Grabbing Jared's arm, she hauled him to his feet. "Forget it," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "We find the car, now." Jared nodded, his eyes darting nervously between the shrine and the shadows creeping closer around them. Together, they turned and crashed through the underbrush, branches clawing at their clothes and skin like desperate hands. The forest screamed around them. The trees groaned and twisted as if alive, their branches reaching down to block their path. The ground beneath them seemed to shift and ripple, like the woods themselves were trying to trap them. Cassie pushed harder, her breath burning in her chest. "Just keep going," she shouted over the cacophony. And then, through the chaos, they saw it. The Jeep. It sat where they had left it, half hidden in a small clearing. For a brief, flickering moment, hope surged in Cassie's chest. But as they drew closer, the hope turned to ice. The Jeep was ruined. Its windows were shattered, jagged, shards of glass glinting like teeth in the moonlight. Deep, ragged claw marks scored the hood and doors, cutting through the paint and into the metal beneath. The tires were shredded, torn to ribbons that hung limp against the dirt. And standing next to it, Logan, or whatever was left of him. He stood, unnaturally still, his head tilted slightly to one side. His skin was pale, almost gray, stretched too tightly over his bones. His eyes were black, glossy voids that reflected nothing. And his mouth stretched into a grotesque, too wide grin, splitting his face from ear to ear. "You left me behind," Logan said softly, his voice layered with something ancient and malicious. "Now it's your turn." Cassie stumbled back, her stomach churning with fear. "That's not him," she whispered. Jared gripped her arm, his eyes fixed on Logan with a mix of horror and disbelief. "Logan." But Logan's smile widened, impossibly so. Behind him, shadows began to emerge from the trees. More figures. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, their limbs bending at wrong angles as they stepped into the clearing. They were all smiling. Each face wore the same too-wide grin, their hollow eyes fixed on Cassie and Jared. The whispers returned, overlapping and growing, louder with each passing second. "Come back. We forgive you. You belong to us now." Cassie's legs refused to move. Her body was frozen, her mind a storm of panic and dread. "Run!" Jared shouted, snapping her out of the trance. Cassie tore her gaze away from Logan's twisted face and bolted, her hand locked around Jared's wrist as they plunged back into the forest. But the faces followed, and the whispers never stopped. Part 6. The Final Choice. Cassie yanked Jared's arm with all her strength, dragging him backward as Logan's grotesque form advanced toward them. The thing that wore Logan's face moved with deliberate, unnatural jerks, each step accompanied by the wet creak of bones that didn't belong to him. The too-wide grin on his face never faltered, his blackened eyes locked on Cassie. Behind him, more figures emerged from the shadows. Familiar faces twisted into unnatural mockeries. Olivia, Dylan, others they didn't recognize, but whose empty gazes seemed to see straight into their souls. The whispers grew louder, layered and relentless, threading through the air like a symphony of despair. "Cassie, Jared, you can't leave. We'll forgive you." Cassie's chest heaved, panic clawing at her throat as she looked around frantically. The Jeep was useless, a battered shell of false hope. The forest itself seemed alive, moving to trap them with shifting roots and clawing branches. "There's no way out," Jared gasped, his voice edged with despair. "They'll never let us leave." Cassie's eyes darted toward the distant outline of the cabin, barely visible through the twisted trunks and rising mist. Smoke still curled lazily into the night sky from the fireplace. The diary's words pounded in her head like a drumbeat. "If you hear your name, don't answer. Don't leave after dark, eve after. Never speak to the woods, if trapped. There is one way to survive. Appease the forest. Appease." Her breath caught as the final rule settled over her like ice. Sacrifice. Cassie's heart felt like it stopped. "Come on," she shouted, gripping Jared's arm tighter. They bolted toward the cabin, their feet pounding against the frost-hardened ground. The forest fought back. Roots rose like serpents to twist around their ankles, sending them sprawling. Branches clawed at their clothes and skin, tearing and scratching with malicious intent. The whispers grew louder still, each word a dagger of guilt and regret. "Cassie, you remember what you did. Jared, you left her behind. We know your secrets." Cassie stumbled but caught herself refusing to look back at the faces that were surely just behind them. She focused on the cabin ahead, her lungs burning with each desperate breath. When they finally crashed through the splintered doorway, the cabin felt like a trap and a sanctuary all at once. The air inside was thick with smoke and decay, the faint warmth from the dying embers in the fireplace offering little comfort. Cassie's eyes scanned the room wildly until they landed on what she needed. A battered metal canister tucked beneath the broken counter. Gasoline. Jared doubled over, gasping for breath, his face pale and streaked with dirt. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Cassie dragged the canister into the center of the room, unscrewing the cap with shaking hands. The acrid smell of fuel filled the air as she began pouring it across the floor, soaking the dry wood and scattered furniture. Jared's face twisted with horror. "You're gonna burn it?" Cassie didn't stop. Her jaw clenched as she moved toward the walls. "It's either this or..." She faltered, unable to finish. Jared grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "Or what, Cassie? What does the diary say? What are you not telling me?" She looked into his eyes, her own filled with unshed tears. "It says, we have to appease the forest. It says there's no other way." Jared's hand dropped, his face slack with disbelief. A loud crash outside sent both of them spinning toward the window. The shapes were closer now, pressing against the cracked glass, their smiling faces illuminated by the faint glow of the firelight. "Cassie, we're waiting." Cassie's hands shook as she turned back to the canister, pouring the last of the gasoline onto the floor. "Light it," she said, her voice hard and resolute. Jared hesitated, the fear etched into his features clear as he stared at the flickering flame of the match in his hand. "Do it," Cassie screamed, her voice cracking. With a deep breath, Jared struck the match. For a second, the flame was small, fragile, almost insignificant. Then it caught. The fire roared to life, exploding across the floor with a ferocity that stole the air from the room. The walls groaned as the flames consumed them, smoke curling upward in thick black tendrils that twisted like grasping fingers. Outside, the forest screamed. Not the trees creaking, not the wind howling. The forest itself. The sound was inhuman, a guttural, enraged howl that made the ground beneath them quake. Cassie and Jared stumbled back, their faces lit by the inferno as the cabin began to collapse around them. The whispers turned to shrieks, a cacophony of rage and despair that echoed through the night. "No, you can't. You'll never leave." The fire climbed higher, devouring everything in its path. Cassie grabbed Jared's arm, pulling him toward the door as the roof began to cave in. "Run!" she shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. They burst out into the freezing night, the cold air hitting them like a wall. Behind them, the cabin burned like a beacon, the flames reaching high into the starless sky. The forest continued to scream, the sound fading only as they stumbled farther and farther away. But even as the noise faded, Cassie couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching and that it wasn't done with them yet. They ran. The forest exploded around them with noise and movement. Branches lashed out like claws, tearing at their clothes and skin. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the chaos like a siren song. "Cassie, Jared, stop running. We forgave you. Come back to us." Cassie's lungs burned as she sprinted, every muscle in her body screaming for rest. But she pushed forward, her eyes fixed on the sliver of hope ahead. The road. Beyond the clearing, it stretched out like a lifeline, its cracked asphalt illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. Freedom. She could almost taste it. Then, without warning, a thick root coiled around Jared's ankle like a serpent. He went down hard, the impact rattling through the ground. The sudden pull yanked Cassie off balance, sending her sprawling into the dirt. She gasped, clawing at the earth as Jared let out a sharp cry of pain. The forest seized its chance. Shadows poured from the tree line, moving with unnatural speed. They weren't just figures anymore. They were creatures, twisted, grotesque forms, with limbs bent at impossible angles and hollow eyes that glinted with malice. The whispers turned to guttural growls, the air vibrating with their hunger. Jared twisted, his hands scrambling to free his ankle from the root's suffocating grip. His eyes met Cassie's, wide with terror and desperation. "Don't let them take me," he pleaded. pleaded, his voice cracking. Cassie froze, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear him over the cacophony of the forest. Her body screamed for her to run. Her mind screamed for her to help. She had seconds to decide. The creatures were closing in, their grotesque forms crawling and slithering across the ground, their grins wide and gleaming. Cassie's hands trembled as she reached out toward Jared, her voice trembling. "Jared, hold on!" But the forest was faster. The root tightened its grip, dragging Jared backward toward the tree line. He screamed, his voice raw and filled with panic. Cassie's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face. Her instincts screamed, louder than her heart. She made a choice, one she would never forgive herself for. She ran. Her legs moved before her mind could process the guilt. She tore through the clearing, her breath ragged and broken. Jared's scream stabbed into her back like knives, each one sharper than the last. "Cassie, don't leave me." But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop, not until her feet hit the cracked asphalt of the road. The sudden change in terrain jolted her, nearly sending her to her knees. She stumbled, her hand slamming against the hood of a passing truck. The vehicle screeched to a halt, its headlights cutting through the night. Cassie banged on the hood with what little strength she had left, her voice hoarse. "Help me, please, help me!" The driver, a kind-faced old man with weary eyes, rushed out, his arm steadying her trembling frame. "What happened?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Drive," Cassie gasped. "Just drive. Please." He didn't ask any more questions. He helped her into the truck, slamming the door shut before climbing into the driver's seat. As the engine roared to life, Cassie glanced out the back window. The forest loomed in the distance, the tree line a dark, impenetrable wall, but something about it seemed different. The trees bent slightly, their gnarled branches bowing in unison. It was almost as if they were bowing, welcoming her back anytime. Days later, Cassie sat in the dim light of her apartment, staring blankly at the wall. The sounds of the city buzzed faintly in the background, a distant hum that did nothing to fill the silence in her mind. Jared's screams still echoed in her ears. Every night since her escape, she'd heard them, the way his voice cracked, the way he begged, the way she ran. Her hands shook as she reached for her coffee cup, but she didn't drink. She couldn't. The taste of guilt was too bitter. Her eyes drifted to her nightstand. There, lying on top of her unread mail, was a piece of paper she didn't recognize. Cassie frowned, picking it up with trembling hands. The handwriting was messy, uneven, almost childlike. It read, "We're still listening. We'll see you soon." Her blood ran cold. Her breath hitched as she turned her head slowly toward the window. Outside, across the street, the moonlight illuminated the park she'd walked by every day for years. Only now, the trees were moving. Their branches swayed in, an unnatural rhythm, though there was no wind. And faintly, almost imperceptibly, she heard it, her name, Cassie. The whispers were back, and they were waiting.